Okay, thanks for having me. It won't be much of a lecture, really. I'll just speak for a very short time. And most of the time we'll have together, I think, will be just talking, and I'll answer questions you have. And so I won't speak for too long. I suppose I was asked if I would speak to you about nonviolence because many of you know, many of you have been students of mine, and some of my best students, that I am a pacifist, so it's not merely a theoretical position for me, but a position that I actually hold. I have deep convictions about it, so that is why I am here, I suppose. So, first of all, I want to say that it seems clear to me, and I hope also to you, that as we human beings think about the human condition and human experience and human history, we quite obviously and understandably see it as a unfolding of conflict. And whatever ideology you adhere to, however conservative or progressive you are, whether you're a Marxist or a Burkean, you know, it's easy to see human history as a history of conflict. And there are winners and there are losers. And there are a lot of dead bodies. And the hope of most people is that the right bodies are the dead ones. And that the people with right or truth or justice on their side are the ones who remain standing. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. But history is a history of violence. And I think that very common perception is fundamentally wrong. Whereas history is obviously filled with violence, it's filled with much more nonviolence. Human beings are in conflict often, and almost always find a way to resolve their conflict nonviolently. So to presuppose that nonviolence simply can't work is, it seems to me, an empirically dubious claim. Now, if only we were trained differently, you know, by our public schools, by our cultures, by our societies, by our traditions, by our books, and so on, I think we could probably look at human history and see it as the unfolding of nonviolence, at least as easily as we see it as the unfolding of violence. And I'll just mention two texts, maybe three texts to you that are of some help in so doing. One is a book written by Jonathan Schell, entitled, and I think some of you have read this, The Unconquerable World. Another is a book written by Duval and Ackerman entitled The Force More Powerful. And the third text is written by John Howard Yoder. It's entitled Nonviolence, A Brief History, The Warsaw Lectures, because unsurprisingly they were a set of lectures he gave in Warsaw. Those three texts, and I'll leave it at those, if you were interested, would give you a glimpse of what I've just said, the claim I've just made, that there is an alternative way to understand human history, and that it's not so much guided by and directed by violence, but as it is nonviolence. Now, nonviolent convictions and practices and theories have both philosophical foundations and spiritual or theological foundations. There are of two kinds. And for a decent text that argues for nonviolence from a philosophical perspective, a perspective that invokes no spirituality, no faith, no religious tradition, no theology, I would recommend a book by Robert Holmes entitled The Problem of War. When it comes to theories, practices, traditions, and communities of nonviolence of the faith or theological variety, there are many. John Howard Yoder, for example, has written a fine book entitled Nevertheless, in which he identifies 19 different kinds of Christian pacifism. So nonviolence is a fact of human existence that has a rich, diverse, sometimes contentious, and interesting history all its own. Now, as to philosophical or non-faith arguments for nonviolence, they usually amount to some form of, if we give it a chance, it'll work. And it's self-evidently a very bad thing to kill people unless you have to do so. And it turns out we really don't have to. So let's not do it. Traditions and communities of nonviolence that are faith-based, by faith-based I mean, of course, religious, spiritual, or theologically based, sometimes make that argument too, but that, of course, is not their entire argument. They're persons who represent faith-based perspectives, of course, think there's some metaphysical truth in the universe, some ultimate moral authority that, in fact, would have us not kill one another. And so there's a kind of obedience, a kind of discipleship, a kind of getting it that may imbue oneself. And so perhaps quite apart from efficacy, perhaps quite apart from whether nonviolence works or not, we should be nonviolent nonetheless. By violence, by the way, I mean lethal violence purposefully directed towards other human beings. Now, I can't speak authoritatively about all kinds of nonviolence from all kinds of religious traditions. That's just something I'm not up to. But I can say a little bit about certain kinds of Christian pacifism, and so I'll say a little bit about that, perhaps. Gandhi said, as many of you know, that when violence does something good, and of course it does on occasion, and perhaps often enough, whatever that means, does do something good, the good is both temporary and it brings with it consequences which are not good. And so the employ of violence is, to say the very least, you know, for every step forward, you take at least a step back. There's no way to use violence in some kind of pure, clean, unproblematic, surgical, beautiful way. And Gandhi said, on the other hand, when people act non-violently, yet with courage and you know, non-violently in a certain way, even in the moment, although it may look ineffective or problematic or that it warrants further destruction and harm and so on, in fact, in the long run it does much more good. And so there's a cumulative effect over history whereby nonviolence is efficacious.